You're about to meet the innovators and influencers who are restoring the Judeo-Christian foundations of our culture right here on The Patrick Coffin Show.
And now, here's your host, Patrick Coffin.
Yes, indeed. Welcome to the Patrick Coffin Show. I am the aforementioned Patrick Coffin. So many exciting things to talk about, things that are near and dear to my heart, things that I've been asked about. Art, poetry, the mystery of words, the mystery of life, the interaction of all three, the dearth of Catholics in the arts, art and Christian faith, the difference between Christian art and art by Christians. We're going to plunge deep and wide, hopefully, with our guest who knows an awful lot about all of the above. Probably the most qualified person I can think of to weigh in about art and mystery and high-quality communication through poetry. He's Dana Gioia. He's the former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. He's a degree holder from Stanford University and Harvard University, and he was named by Governor Gerald Brown the Poet Laureate of California these 2 years ago. He's also published 5 full-length collections of poetry, most recently 99 poems, new and selected. Dana Gioia, it is an honor to have you.
Glad to be here.
I thought I'd start with you, Dana, and ask you if there was a time in your life when a light bulb went on and you realized, I'm half decent at stringing words together. Was that when you were an executive working in the corporate world, or was it something you discovered in boyhood and kind of went fallow on you?
Well, it's a complicated question to ask because yesterday I started to work on a longish poem I had abandoned 2 years ago, and I surely didn't feel yesterday that I was good at stringing words together.
Mm-hmm.
So as a poet, you're at the mercy of your muse, at the mercy of inspiration. Mm-hmm. You can have all the verbal skill in the world, but it's always something that's a conversation with essentially a power beyond your own control. I came to realize that I was a writer slowly, I think, in some ways. I mean, I knew from a very early age that I was motivated by different things from the people around me. Mm-hmm. I was deeply moved by music, by art, by literature, in ways that most people weren't. Most of my friends were musicians. Most of the only training I really got in the arts was music, piano, saxophone, clarinet. So that shaped my sense of what I was. But when I was about 19 or 20, I was actually in Vienna, Austria. Mm-hmm. I had gone abroad to study German and music, and which my California State scholarship, at that point covered. College was so inexpensive back then. Mm-hmm. And I found myself writing poems and reading poems. And when I came back to the United States at the age of 20, I realized that my life work was to be a poet. I also realized that I wasn't nearly as good at it as I needed to be. Mm-hmm. And so I really set myself down for years and tried to improve myself as a writer. It's a very complicated thing, and it's an endless conversation you have with your own psyche and imagination. I then decided I was going to be I had to make a living. I was the oldest kid in a working class family. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to be a poet, what do? Well, of course, you be a professor. So I went off to Harvard Graduate School to be a professor and write poetry. And after a couple of years, I realized being a professor, at least for me, was a terrible place to be if you wanted to be a poet. It made you too self-conscious, too intellectual, too analytical. I wanted to write poems that could stand up against the great tradition, but were also accessible to the people I came from. Mm-hmm. And so I left Harvard Graduate School, which was had been very good to me. I had a very comfortable life there. I needed a job, so I went to business school, and I made myself a promise that I would write and read every day for 3 hours. Hmm. And no matter how busy I was, and I'd work 10, 11, 12-hour days, I did that. And so during, my 17 years, two in business school and 15 in the corporate world. I worked, full time. I mean, more than full time. It was an exhausting, demanding career, and I came home and wrote.
Did you find? Did you? It's, of course, it's about.
So it was an evolving thing. Go ahead.
I wanted to know how did you do the math? Were those 3 hours acquired by night owling it, or did you make yourself become an early bird just to sit down and make sure it was done?
I can do nothing. Nothing in terms of literary work in the morning. I'm a nocturnal person. I mean, the one good thing about a corporate job is I had to get there very early in the morning, and otherwise I wouldn't have been writing then anyway.
Yeah.
So I would come home. I am a person of another century, quite literally. I was born on Christmas Eve, 1950, and so when I was in the business world, it was tough, competitive. The management, the management had sort of a military style. So it was very brutal by today's standards, but it was infinitely more gentle because the internet had not really been quite invented. It was only during my last years in business that the internet. So when you went home at night, you went home.
Yeah.
People didn't email you, all night long. If someone called me from the office in the evening, it meant that there was an honest-to-God emergency. The factory had caught on fire. A plane had crashed. A strike had been called.
Yeah.
So I would come home. My wife and I would make dinner. We'd have dinner together. We'd have a cup of coffee after dinner together. She would read, and I would go into another room and work on my writing, and that was our rhythm. And I've been I know this sounds scandalous, but I've been married to the same woman now for almost 38 years, and she is a very loving and intelligent and deep gal. And she likes to read, she likes to do Bible study. And so she was she never gave me a bad time about working on this. She understood it was my calling, and she always had things to keep herself busy.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think right now she's not home because she's at one of her 2 Bible study groups, or other days she's at Catholic Charities, working with the homeless. Yeah. And so, it was, I was lucky to have the right person. And I'll tell this to people: if you want to do something serious in life, if you want to be a writer, you want to be an artist, you want to have some kind of achievement that does not come automatically out of your daily life, you do it by giving things up. Nothing comes without a price. And so I just said, well, we're not going to go off for little weekends. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. And, on the weekends, we would go to the theater or we'd go to the movie or something. But, we created a life that was really quite, very much the two of us, at least until the kids came. Mm-hmm. Now, children, that's an issue.
That is an issue and a half. Well, it sounds like the life you've carved out with your good wife is kind of avant-garde in itself. I'm reaching out to a writer named Robert Putnam. I'm not sure if you've heard of Putnam's book.
I know the name. I don't know him.
It's called Bowling Alone: The Collapse and Revival of American
Community. Well, that's right. That's exactly. I read part of that. It came out about 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, just that the aggregate loss of social capital, Knights of Columbus meetings, Lions clubs, junior chambers.
All of the civic, civil society,
right?
Around people. So that's what one of the really powerful things that the church provides. Mm-hmm. It's maybe the last bulwark against a very atomized and depersonalized society. But anyway, for me, the writing is a lifetime dedication. You have peaks and valleys, and you follow the course of it the way that you follow the course of your own destiny.
Mm-hmm. Do you wait for the muse, or do you have to force the muse to arrive by simply beginning to write and giving yourself the freedom that what I'm about to write might be horrible? Does that question make sense?
I could sit down and write some elegant verses for you.
Mm-hmm.
They would be soulless. I do not write poetry except when I'm inspired. Now, let me qualify that, because by inspiration, it means that just something comes to you. It's involuntary. I feel it physically. If I have a poem coming, my body feels different. My temples flush. My throat constricts. I feel, in a sense, the coming of this thing as this physical frisson.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you saw what I would write down, you'd say, what pathetic nonsense is that? I might just write a rhythm down. I might write a line down, or a couple of lines, or I might circle around an image. But there's something that has just gone on that I don't fully understand it, which is where my subconscious, my conscious, my memory, my imagination has all come into they've all come together at once. I may, and often have, taken that draft that I write. Let's say, if I'm lucky, I don't have anything else going on. That's very rare. And I can actually write for half an hour. I get a couple of pages of disconnected lines. I may indeed take that into 100 drafts over 5-10 years. But I have a poem that I could read you that took me 25 years to write.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I hope it doesn't sound like it, but what you do is you begin to tease it out. And at that point is, where does the language want to go? How do you create language that ultimately is independent from me or you? I mean, if I die, the poem should still work,
Yeah.
And so, how do you create this independent web of words that casts a spell that evokes the original feeling you had?
Mm-hmm.
That is a mystery. That's why creative writing departments, though there are thousands of them, can't really create literature. It's the individual imagination that does. And when you force a poem, I think what you can get at best a very nice surface, a very nice idea, but it doesn't have the inspiration, and I use that word in a Catholic sense, that a poem should have. I should be able to create something that comes out of the deepest parts of me, that if it works, speaks to the depths and heights in you.
That's the paradox, isn't it? The deeper you go into you, the more likely it will spark some deep significance in me, or a complete stranger, or even a stranger who will read you 100 years after you've gone.
Yeah, if you do it right. Otherwise, it's just a big embarrassing mess.
There's a
I hate to be. I don't mean to sound cynical with this, but I treat art as something sacred. It is a kind of it represents the highest faculties of humanity, and I hate to see it commoditized. I hate to see it become an accoutrement of our narcissistic society, in which everyone is a genius.
Are you saying you didn't leave the corporate world for poetry for the money? Is that where we're going with this?
Well, the funny, the weird thing, Patrick, is I quit. I quit just because I realized if as I lost my first son.
Yes.
At the age of 40, I had lost a son. I had been more successful. People think I got rich in business. I just, I would that I had. But, I got a salary. I was able to pay my, student loans off. We were able to buy a little townhouse in Westchester, in a not snazzy neighborhood, but we had, have a home. And I just realized that, you only have one life.
Yeah. And
that I had been I'd been working in business because I had nothing, from my family. My family was a very wonderful but very a poor, large, working-class Catholic family.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the oldest person. I knew that I would probably have to help my parents when they got older, and indeed I did have to. I knew that my youngest siblings probably needed help to get through school, and indeed they did, and that somebody in the family had to be responsible, and so it was me. But I did that, and I'd sort of gotten through the first wave of responsibilities, and I just said, and by that time I was really quite well known as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
I was sort of famous as this businessman poet, and I talked to my wife, and I said, I think if I quit, I can make a living.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really hard for a couple of years, but guess what? I did.
Yeah.
And so, I was very blessed, that I was able to write while I worked in business, because I'm the only person in human history who went to Stanford Business School to be a poet.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just my vehicle to find to create a life which would take me out of the literary market, so I could write the way I wanted to write, not the way that the market demanded I write.
Sure.
And then I moved at such a point, where I was able to make a living. And, it's been a really weird life. I've done a lot of things, as you know, but, I've been able to sort of stay one step ahead, of things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I say that as the father of two young men. I've got a son who's 24 and a son who's 28, and God help me, both of them have decided to be writers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very tough on these kids.
Yeah.
There's so much less opportunity for a young writer than there used to be. There's more teaching jobs, perhaps, more grants, but actually to be a working writer, and write to an audience and develop your craft as a young person, it's almost it's almost disappeared.
Well,
so I'm interested to see what's going to happen to them.
That's the real paradox, isn't it? I'm an amateur student of Walter Ong and Marshall McLuhan, and back before the invention of the modem, you had to look to publishers and media outlets, and you had to go cap in hand. Now, with the digital revolution and the internet, everybody can be Shakespeare, or they think they can. But then you've got a competitive pool of 1 trillion people trying to do this exact same thing you are trying to do. That makes it hard.
That's true, and that clutters the whole environment. But there's something actually more pernicious that's gone
Mm-hmm.
on in our culture. No organization, no private organization in the history of humanity has been as wealthy as Apple is now.
Mm-hmm.
Or Amazon, is now. Or these things are richer than nations. They have created this web, and they have created a situation where artists essentially work for them for free.
Mm-hmm.
They pirate music, they pirate writing, they pirate books that people have spent their lives creating and get no recompense. Or if you actually even write for them, full-time writer, you get paid virtually nothing and are forced to create constant. There's a friend of mine who a very good writer, has to write 4 pieces a day.
Yeah.
For this very famous service that he's in, which I think almost entirely assures that they'll never write anything that's worth rereading. So I think it's a very difficult thing, and it's to a certain degree my instinct, which I still have, which is to keep yourself out of the market, is the best way to write art. Now the odd thing is I've become famous for certain things that I've written, but those are things that were written entirely insanely against the market, like The Catholic Writer Today. I gave it as a lecture. I gave the lecture over about 7-8 years, constantly revising it, talking to audiences. Every time I gave it, somebody would record it and transcribe it and want to publish it. I'd say no.
Mm-hmm.
And then I finally published. I gave it to First Things. The editor of First Things, tried to cut it, tried to change it. I was ferocious, and I allowed 2 sections to be dropped. Because it was long, but nothing else to be changed. Although I did get many good suggestions from one of their editors, who was working with me on some of the details. I had to fight it, even somebody as well known as me, for them not to meddle with it. And then it came out, and it created an international response.
Well, I'm holding it in my hands.
But you have to, in a funny way, you have to sort of, remember the novelist, the very great novelist, Anthony Burgess?
Of course,
author of
Clockwork Orange. Yep.
Yeah,
sure.
And Nothing Like the Sun, and very fine, great novelist. I interviewed him once.
Oh,
and we spent, it was an interview. It was supposed to be an hour long, and we ended up spending 7 hours.
Yep.
Seven increasingly drunken hours, I should say, in the St. Regis bar in New York. I met him for breakfast, and finally at about 6 p.m. his wife, came and dragged him away. And we had this fantastic, sort of once in a lifetime conversation. But, he didn't realize, he knew I was working in business, and he knew I was interviewing him. And so he had quizzed me. And he says, "Well, funny, discovered I was a poet." And he goes, "You're a poet." He says, "That means you write for God." And I think it was the best advice I ever got, because when you write for God, first of all, you have all the time in the world. Secondly, God knows, when you're faking it. God knows when you're not saying the truth. God knows when you haven't worked with sufficient intensity, to say something of value.
Yeah.
And so I've always in my poetry and in my best prose. Now, I say this as somebody who also for years had to work as a reviewer and things like that. So you have, I've got the copy. I try to write in one of two ways. Write something that 25 or 50 or 100 years from now somebody can read with pleasure and clarity. And the second category is to write something that's good enough to be published tomorrow.
Yeah.
But I keep those categories separate. And and so the core of my work, I'm trying to write at my highest possible level. Now, I say that knowing that what I write may be crap, but at least I don't see it's crap. If you know what I mean. I've worked as hard as I can to make it as good as I can. If that's not good enough, then that is my failure. But it's an honest failure, then, I think.
Dana, you've Trojan horsed so much content in that one answer. I'm tempted to pop back to Anthony Burgess's comment that as a poet you write for God. Do you sense that you were talking about this physical thing, the tightening of the throat and the maybe the vein in the temple? Is there something preternatural there that you're drawing from something that is transcendent in some way, and that's going to speak to someone beyond something that will concern us this week, that you are writing, if not for the ages, certainly from beyond the frame of your own life? Do you sense that when you're creating something? You just know you're in that zone and it's going to mean something?
I think it would be deeply wrong and possibly delusional for me to say that any of my inspiration has any supernatural origin. I believe in the grace of God. I believe in the kind of enlightenments, but it is poetry is a human art, and I think the poet is on very dangerous moral territory when he or she claims to be speaking in any kind of divine inspiration. I think that's it's dangerous at the very least. That being said, I am a Catholic. I see the world as a Catholic through the framework of our faith, through the strength of our tradition, with the aid of the great thinkers and writers that have come out of our tradition, as well as the saints whose lives rather than whose writing clarify existence for us, and that strengthens my writing. That gives my human capacity, in a sense, stronger frames by which to understand, my own experience, and to try to clarify them in some ways. I do. I'm deeply uncomfortable in situations where I'm with Catholic or Christian writers where they begin talking about their direct line to the Almighty or to the supernatural.
The Lord's anointing this one.
Unless you have an angel come down and touch your lips with a burning charcoal, let's be humble about our productions, because out of that humility, perhaps, comes truth. I mean, a very great man. I don't think you've met him. I wish you had him. Kevin Starr.
Oh, the historian.
Greatest historian of California.
I never did. He just passed away a few.
History of.
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, who just finished, but just published the first volume of a history of the Catholic Church in North America, who died suddenly a few months ago. Kevin, would say, Dana, you know how Thomas Aquinas defined humility? And I say, no. Humility is seeing things as they really are, seeing yourself as you really are. And I think that's really true. That we need to begin as artists by humility, seeing ourselves as who we are. Literature is a vast and endless conversation that goes back to the origins of humanity. It existed before writing existed. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have participated in this. And like any conversation, you come and you listen, you take in as much as you can, and then with great modesty, you make your first remarks, and you enter into that conversation, respecting the scope, the power, the unknowable variety of it. And so, and that's what I think. And I think that's very Catholic. I mean, a Catholic writer understands that that we are part of a 2,000-year tradition. Actually, longer if you sort of say that to the period before Christ, the Old Testament period, the classical period, all of the human wisdom that preceded the incarnation, and it's those long perspectives. And if you're looking back to Homer, to Virgil, to Dante, to Shakespeare, it's a humbling experience. On the other hand, it gives you a standard worth striving for.
Where you're somewhere between self-abasement and self-puffery, and it's the real you creating.
Well, you should have both of them simultaneously. It's not puffery. You should, as a writer, simultaneously experience confidence and total self-doubt.
Sure.
And it's out of that dialectic, I think comes something interesting, because, I don't believe in that life is about this single thing or this single thing. It's all these forces kind of hitting you at the same time, and it's balancing. When I was a teenager, I used to body surf, at the beaches of L.A., and it's body surfing. You have these waves that are coming that are beyond your control, and if you catch them just right, you almost fly over the waves, and you are brought with gentleness and style onto the shore. If you catch it wrong, man, you're pounded.
And Peter Kraft has 2 books on this, on the philosophy of body surfing. I kid you not. There's something. There's a lot of spiritual overlap there, in that almost Zen-like experience of riding that wave, and you become one with the wave. There's something also creative about it. Can I jump back a little bit to the Catholic writer today? And you were talking about dealing with the editors here and there, and of First Things. And I'm so glad that they.
No, once again, let me just say that. I'm grateful to the First Things to publish it. They've been very kind to me and everything else. But my point was just that even with the editors that support you and help you, their perspective and the artist's perspective are always slightly different. I don't mean to criticize them.
That's not where I was going with this. I was talking about the great bifurcation between the the literary world of Catholic writers after World War II, which is something you bring out in Section 4. You've got this lovely list of Claire Booth Luce and Robert Giroux and Muriel Spark, Elizabeth Jennings, and some other Catholic immigrants. But chances are good that if your name wasn't Dana Gioia and it wasn't 5 or 10 years ago, and your name was, let's say, Yves Lenoir or Hilaire Belloc, your work would be perhaps as likely to be published in a more mainstream secular forum talking about specifically Catholic themes. Nowadays, they're almost separate, hermetically sealed, silos. There's almost no interflow. That's where I was going with this.
No, it is well, there's two things that really have happened in contemporary American letters for Catholic writers. First, the secular world, the literary world, is not Catholic friendly. At best, it's sort of indifferent. They really don't want you, talking about those, those things. And then that kind of, and in some cases they're openly hostile.
Yeah.
So that kind of hostility or indifference to not just Catholicism but to Christianity, in the literary world has been matched by a collapse of the Catholic literary culture. I have to say, I tend to be optimistic. I've been sort of shocked by the Philistinism and the ignorance, in a lot of Catholic publications, or even the comments thing where somebody will publish an article on this. I mean, it's about 2 months ago, and somebody would write back saying, "Literature is no good because it's fiction. Catholics should. It's all about the truth and not, nonfiction and anything else. And this story." So I actually, after seeing about 10, 15 people say these idiotic, ignorant remarks, which I think is astonishing to me for Catholics who should understand the power of art. I simply pointed out that if you took the trouble to read the Gospels, Jesus communicated, to the crowds with fiction by telling parables, by making up stories which embody the truth. We don't, I don't think as Catholics we believe that there were 7 wise and 7 foolish virgins. These are constructions to communicate the deepest and most complicated truths of humanity, which you can't really give by abstraction. You can give by embodying them. If you read the parable of the Prodigal Son, when I was a kid, I read it, and I knew exactly what it was about. It was about a kid who misbehaved and did bad stuff.
Yeah.
When I got older, I realized it's about the father, who's got this kid who's breaking his heart, who squanders his money. I have to say, as I got older still, and I've been dealing with, my whole complicated family, and so I think it's mostly about the good brother who has to put up with all this crap.
That's right.
But the fact is that the story is about all of those things and more, and you could only tell truth that complicated, that dynamic in a story. So, I think that we have now. As I say, about the Philistine and ignorant nature of much of Catholic public culture. Let me say that I think it has been getting better in the last couple of years. I think my article and a few other articles, I think, called to task a lot of the really talented, educated, cultured people in the Catholic community, and they've realized that they need to be more, not aggressive, but visionary, more ambitious about what they're doing with their publications, and that we need to make some room for the culture. We need to enter the arts and culture, with a Catholic voice. And we need to call to those great things in our own tradition, rather than just get caught up in moralistic, dogmatic ideas of literature. lot of Catholics, what they say, well, what literature should be is a story of a good person doing good things for good ends, which theologically is sound and illustrates all the principles of our faith.
Yeah, right.
Literature, art moves differently.
Or a story about a bad person who gets badly punished because he deserves it.
Yeah, I mean, well, anyway, we can talk about it. I mean, I don't want to veer off into aesthetics and poetics.
Well, let me
But the fact is that we live in a complicated world, and the only way to reflect the actual experiences that we have, the experiences with real life, the intimations of the divine, is in creating stories, poems, paintings, songs, music, which basically encompass the fullness of our humanity and the fullness of our aspirations, towards the divine.
Well, this is
That's
what
a
I'm.
big task.
Yeah, part of that ambition, it seems to me, is moving the needle outside the Catholic believosphere, so that you're not creating, I call it by for content by Catholics for Catholics, which is wonderful. We need more of it probably, but it's not going to appear outside our own sphere of almost echo chamber environment.
Yeah, well, I think a Catholic writer has two audiences. It's got a Catholic audience and a broader audience. The broader audience, by the way, includes Catholics.
Yeah.
And if your writing doesn't work in both groups, you're probably not writing well enough.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not about saying, well, then you got to pretend that you believe in things you don't believe in. It's that your stories have got to be good enough. Your poems have got to be, your songs have got to be good enough. Your music has got to be so deeply moving that it speaks to people across humanity. Across not necessarily everybody in the world needs to like it in exactly the same way, but that a diverse group of people can respond to it, in their own ways.
Yeah, it's not parochial in a sense. It's universal. It'll resonate in Tokyo or in Santee, California.
Yeah, and universalism is not well understood. I mean, for literature, when you say Shakespeare is universal, they say, well, postmodern criticism, has attacked that term because they say, well, what is universal? But what people have meant by universal is that this work, let's say it's Hamlet, has spoken to a great many people in a great many places, in a diversity of time, and across many cultures. Some people may not like it, some people may misunderstand it, but it has a kind of resilience and accessibility that goes way beyond the age and the place that created it.
I have a book recommendation for you on this topic. It's an interview I did. It's going to be, in fact, I'd love to pair you guys together one week then another. His name is Sohrab Ahmari. Sohrab was raised in Tehran, Iran, in a secular Muslim household. And last July, remember the French priest, Father Jacques Hamel, was murdered after Mass in Normandy? Yes. That was the day when Sohrab announced his conversion, his intention to become a Catholic, which he has since done. And I interviewed him about a book that's coming out next month. It's called The New Philistines. And it's on so much overlap of what you've just shared so far. The popular idea that Shakespeare has to be made relevant. You have to put him in a 1940s garb, or you have to kind of sex him up, otherwise he's a dead white guy. There's a lot of similarity.
Well, yeah. I mean, so much of our official artistic culture is dominated by novelty. There's this terrible anxiety people in the arts world have that unless they somehow disguise the work or gussy it up, that it will have no appeal. Mm-hmm. I've always felt that that if you're interested in the arts, you have to have a confidence that the work itself has a kind of power that's beyond you. It's kind of a battery, and all you have to do is make the connection. Now, sometimes new production ideas, new this, that, and the other, are clarifying, but more often, you see a production of Mozart's Don Giovanni, set on the moon during a miners' strike, with aliens wandering around. It really isn't. It's just the director, desperately trying to call attention to himself or herself. Anyway, but I have been transformatively moved by works of art. It was true in childhood. I'll see something now, as a man on the edge of old age, which suddenly bring back all kinds of things that I once knew about life that I'd forgotten. And that's the great power of art. And when you lose that, when you lose the conversation with these works, I think you kind of harden into a smaller version of yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think that the Church, the American Catholic Church, in many ways has hardened into a smaller version of itself. It's a kind of bunker mentality, mm-hmm. and I see it in my own parish. And I think that we need to aspire, beyond that. We are, after all, the Catholic Church, the universal church.
You kindly introduced me to the music of Morten Lauridsen, and when I heard, it's the song that appears on his the main page of his website, "Sure as the Something." I forget the title,
yeah.
But I had to stop what I was doing. It was just so much to absorb. It's so elegant and so. It just beggars description. Its effect on me, and I've since cranked through the CD that you kindly sent as well, including the setting. It's so there's that striking evangelical power to something beautiful.
Morten Lauridsen, who lives born in Portland, raised in Washington State, has been at USC now for almost, I think, 40 years. He came as a student and he stayed as a professor, mm-hmm. is a composer of such radiant lyrical power that again and again people just tell me they're driving, they hear this piece of music that they've never heard before, and it makes them pull over to the side of the road and weep. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't compose very much, but what he has composed in the last 20 years, he's become, I think, pretty much the most widely performed choral composer in the living choral composer mm-hmm. in the United States, and it's sort of international. And he hasn't been championed by the critics. What happens is that a singer sings his music and then has to find a circumstance to sing it again because it is so magnificent.
Yeah.
And the music is mostly religious. There's an Ave
yes.
Maria. There's his masterpiece, which is actually being done within the next 4 weeks at Disney Hall with the LA Master Chorale, is a thing called Lux Aeterna, eternal light.
Yes.
It's based on 4 medieval religious texts, and it is to die for, quite literally.
I'm gonna look for that. I'll look for that.
But what's interesting to me, besides just the magnificence of the work, is that when I first heard Lauridsen's music, I heard Lux Aeterna. Didn't know anything about him, never had met him. It stopped me in my tracks. It just, what it said to me is that even today, even in California, mm-hmm. Even as somebody who has at that point never really gotten much official recognition, you can create a masterpiece of the highest order, a mm-hmm. work which, when people experience, it takes them out of themselves and makes them, in a sense, see their own existence sub specie aeternitatis. And that success, that magnificent achievement, gives me the faith to say that as an artist, no matter how discouraged I am, mm-hmm. That I can't say, well, it's impossible to do it now. Why do I even try? Everything's against me. No, sure. We proceed proceed by faith. I mean, there's a poem of mine which I say and sometimes we proceed by prophecy or not at all.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's that each and every one of us, no matter what we are doing as Catholics, have an enormous sense of the presence of our full life through time toward mortality, and beyond that, the transcendent realm of the divine, which we have, through Christ and the Gospels and through the Church, been given access to.
Mm-hmm.
And what it asks us, and this is the thrill of Catholicism, this is also that makes it so damn hard, is that what you have is a sense of being alive that asks you to make every moment of your own existence stand for something,
mm-hmm.
represent something. It can be the little way, or it can be some huge way, but that there is no excuse to waste a moment of your life, even to waste suffering. In fact, suffering is perhaps the greatest gift that God gives us.
You're talking about composing and Morten Lauridsen. I was thinking about imagining the composer at one end of the spectrum and the poet at the other. And the composer seems to me is trying to speak without words, and the poet is kind of doing the inverse, trying to create music without notes. Is there some truth to? Am I insane, or does this resonate?
Although in Lauridsen, most of Lauridsen's music is vocal or choral.
Mm-hmm.
So he so there are words that are his vehicles. But I think I believe that a poet is a songwriter. That that the art of poetry and the art of song are really two sides of the same art. You go back to the ancient world, all lyric poetry was sung. I mean, lyric lyre. I mean, lyric poetry was the poetry that was sung with a kind of the ancient version of a guitar, a lyre.
Like the Psalms.
Dramatic poetry was danced and sung. Choral poetry was sung by voices. And so, the notion that these in ancient languages, the word for song and poem are the same word.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as you get later in civilization, they become separated. But the poem, I think, must always bear the memory of the song, the chant, maybe even the dance. There has to be a physicality
mm-hmm.
About it, for it to really speak to us in the way that we recognize as intrinsically poetic.
Dana, who stole poetry from ordinary people? How did it become an arcane thing in an ivory tower?
It's a complicated issue, but I mean, I think if you were going to generalize, is that what happens is that artists become preoccupied with their own medium. If you do something, you can. I mean, like I was reading a review last night about this one guy who discovered that if you played a clarinet against a timpani, it creates this really weird sound. And so,
mm-hmm.
he's always trying to create music which, goes,
yeah.
and it's an interesting sound. But you see, he becomes preoccupied with that in a way which perhaps takes him away from the conversation that with an audience. But I think in the 19th century, you begin to have in France with the symbolists the creation of a magnificent poetry that is somewhat arcane. It's brought over into the English-speaking and the German-speaking and the Russian-speaking world around the turn of the century. And in the United States, you think of poets like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Wallace Stevens, who began in a sense, writing a poetry which is beyond the immediate comprehension of even most literary people.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, in Eliot, Stevens, this is great poetry, but it's in a Mandarin mode. You also have a group of people who have since childhood been raised with a typewriter and begin to sort of see poetry as a visual thing, letters on a page, which removes it somewhat from the auditory, from the saying and the hearing, of it. And they're fascinated by these things. So you have this energy of creative energy, which is tended to be more inwardly focused. Now, at the same time, that's your first reason. At the same time, you have through electronic technology the creation of film, silent film first, and then spoken film. You have the creation of radio. You have recordings. Eventually, this comes through, with television, with having radios in your car, which the creation of the internet, of videos, et cetera, et cetera. And this creates a vast entertainment culture, which now dominates the globe with a kind of hypnotic power. And so that you have that going on. So that's distracting people. And you have, for the first time, in human culture, a kind of division between, a kind of highly produced popular culture and an elegantly produced Mandarin culture, high and low culture. Then the third thing that goes on is you have the creation, not just in America, but everywhere in the world, of this huge university system, which is, as societies become more affluent and more technological, you need more and more people trained to administer them, et cetera, et cetera. And in those academic worlds, you tend to have hyper-specialization. And for physics, hyper-specialization is probably the only means of making new discoveries. In literature, it's a more complicated quality. In fact, it has as much downside, I think, perhaps even more downside than it has upside, because you tend to have people making their careers only by talking to other people in their same career,
Right.
So you have all these things going on, and I think in the process, poetry went from, think of somebody like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, who in his own lifetime was an international celebrity. His birthday was a holiday, and everybody in the United States pretty much would have known something of Longfellow's by heart. In the same way that everybody would know a Beatles song by heart.
Yeah, right.
And you have that, his great nephew is Ezra Pound, who basically, has created poetry, which some of which is very good, by the way, which very few people can understand. It has very, somewhat limited readership, and you come to a point right now where poets almost take for granted that they only write for other poets in this kind of closed and tiny professional world. That is why I left Harvard. I did not want to be an artist who only wrote for not even other people in the English department, because people in the English department don't read the poets, just the other poets in the English department do.
Yeah.
That I wanted to actually to write for what I would call a mixed, intelligent audience. I don't, think that 100% of the people in the United States will ever read my poems, but I would like to write a poem that 20% of the people in America, or 50% of the people in America, or whatever the number is, could, if they read it, if they heard it, respond to. I think what a real artist does, at least a poet does, is to bring your own audience into existence, to create an audience that can read and respond to your work. Now, in all fairness, I think to a certain degree, Eliot and Wallace Stevens, did this. Although, it's an audience that has to be trained. I mean, when I teach my students at USC, where I teach each fall semester, to read Wallace Stevens, it's hard for them. I have to work through them in a way that other poets they can read much more directly.
Is that because
So-
of what they've previously been exposed to? Because I remember really hating half of the stuff that was force-fed to me in Eastern Canada as a kid, from E. Cummings to, I remember reading a few lines of Howl by Alan Ginsberg, and I wanted to just throw up. By contrast, this more, rhyme, fixed meter format, very elegant, that you are creating is almost like punk. It's almost like the new avant-garde.
There's an element about, I mean, it's a whole other bunch of issues. I mean, the rhyme and meter were banned from American poetry for about 20, 30 years.
Right.
And I was part of a group of young poets who revived rhyme, meter, and storytelling. Narrative, telling a story that isn't about you.
Sure.
But I think what makes rhyme and meter powerful is two things. First of all, if you do it well, it creates a musical structure which has a kind of hypnotic quality. You could it's like if you go to a concert, a rock concert, and people move with the beat, that the physicality of the beat puts people in a trance state.
Yeah.
Not a helpless, trance state, but they're able to synchronize their bodies with the work of art.
Mm-hmm.
That's what meter does. And secondly, it creates a framework where people know the game that's being played. If I took, somebody who had never seen a basketball, to a basketball game, they'd see people running around, but they wouldn't be able to understand what was really happening. They wouldn't be able to understand why suddenly they stop, or this, that, and the other. And knowing the rules helps you. If you know the rules of basketball, suddenly you can probably see meaningfully, 10 times as much as the person who doesn't.
Yeah.
You understand the relationship of actions to one another, and I felt as an artist now, this is not to say that that what Stevens did, what Eliot did, isn't great, but it's just not what I want to do, and it's also, I think, not what American literature needs right now.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, they were trying to create something new. Poetry was thriving, when in Eliot's childhood. I mean, everybody read poetry, and what he was trying to do, was to create a new sound, a new thing that gave him room to exist. In my culture, people have stopped reading poetry. People continue to write it in probably the greatest quantities ever. But what I'm trying to do is to create a poetry which can re-engage an audience.
One of the
but
poems,
it's also got to be true for me. I'm not pandering to people,
Sure.
because that's the kind of poetry I want to read. I mean, Philip Larkin, one of my favorite poets, Larkin, they asked him about this, he says, I write the kind of poems I'd like to read. And that's what I'm doing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now maybe I'd like to read somebody better than me. I don't know. I mean, I can't, because a poet could never judge how, whether he or she writes well or not. But, if art without an audience is a diminished thing, poetry which does not connect to human readers is a diminished enterprise. And I believe in the fundamental power of the human conversation that we call literature. And it needs to be a conversation. The audience gives energy. Walt Whitman said, to have great poetry, we need great audiences too. And Whitman was absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think of Bob Dylan. Part of the energy Bob Dylan has is the energy that the audience gave him almost from the beginning.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think this is a dilemma for Catholic writers. How do they, in a sense, get this energy from their own community? I think it's very hard. I don't think that the American Catholicism does much to support its artists, and then they moan and groan about how the culture ignores them.
Yeah, it's
when you ignore culture, what do you expect?
Understatement of the century. Agree in full. One of the, I believe you may.
You want to hear a poem?
I was going to ask you to close with one if we could.
We're talking about poetry. We're talking about stuff people.
I wanted to. Can I make
we got to let somebody hear it so they can figure out whether it's crap or not.
Well, here's my request. I remember reading Planting a Sequoia, and then more recently prayer, you and I have the one thing in common parents don't want to have in common, which is we've both lost children. Our third daughter, Naomi, died at age 15 days when I was 42. And
I'm so sorry to hear that. It's a terrible thing to happen.
It's just, there's no words for it. However, there are some graces that can be had at the heart of the grief. And your poem, Prayer, is so, I mean, it's not just about loss. There's so many things that the reader's going to put into it that you may not necessarily have put into it as the creator of it. But I was going to ask if you could finish by reciting Prayer, but if you have another one as well, that I won't say no.
Well, if I do, I'll do Prayer, but Prayer is actually a relatively complicated poem. I'd like to maybe follow it by another poem about my son.
Sure.
Which is called Majority. Very short and very clear.
All right.
Just so that, my first son died at 4 months without warning of sudden infant death syndrome. We simply had a healthy little boy, been to the doctor a couple of days before, and then we found him dead in his crib one morning.
Yeah.
And so, it's one of those 2 or 3 central experiences of my life, and I'm looking at a picture of him right now. I mean, I've never, when people ask me how many kids I have, I said I have 3 sons, one of whom, died. He's part of our lives, and this is just it's a kind of it's a series. Prayer is a series of images that ends, as a kind of prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Echo of the clock tower, footstep in the alleyway, sweep of the wind sifting the leaves, jeweler of the spider web, connoisseur of autumn's opulence, blade of lightning harvesting the sky, keeper of the small gate, choreographer of entrances and exits, midnight whisper, traveling the wires, seducer, healer, deity, or thief. I will see you soon enough, in the shadow of the rainfall, in the brief violet darkening the sunset. But until then, I pray, watch over him, as the mountain guards its covert oar, and the harsh falcon its flightless young.
Gorgeous.
So it's all, essentially one long, sentence that ends in that request. And let me just read a poem that I wrote on what would have been my son's 21st birthday.
Mm-hmm.
When you lose a child, and you know this, whenever you see a kid who would be about the same age as your kid, you go, that's what my son would look like. That's
Correct, yeah.
what my daughter would be doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
So this is about that phantom childhood that we went through, and that I'm now writing on his 21st birthday, and it's therefore called Majority, as in legal majority.
Mm-hmm.
Now you'd be 3, I said to myself, seeing a child born the same summer as you. Now you'd be 6, or 7, or 10. I watched you grow in foreign bodies, leaping into a pool, all laughter, or frowning over a keyboard, but mostly just standing, taller each time. How splendid your most mundane actions seemed in these joyful proxies. I often held back tears. Now you are 21. Finally, it makes sense that you have moved away into your own afterlife.
Beautiful. That's from Pity the Beautiful?
Yeah, they're both in 99 poems.
Sure.
Which is, I have a section of my 99 poems. Rather than arrange the book chronologically, which is the way you're supposed to do it as an academic poet. I took my poems and I arranged them into 7 themes, because I think that's the way readers, well, readers don't care about my chronology. They care about poetry in their lives. So I have mystery, place, remembrance, imagination, stories, songs, and love.
There's a line from Sweeney Todd by Sondheim. It says, it's Mrs. Lovett talking with Sweeney Todd about eating the dead and making them into meat cakes, meat pies. Awful lot of fat, only where it sat. Haven't you got poet or something like that? No, you see, the trouble with poet is, how do you know it's deceased? Try the priest. Dana Joy, I just wish we had...
Sondheim's wonderful.
Yes, no, I love that play. I could go on for hours and hours, but I appreciate the time you did carve out, Dana. Thanks for being a gift. Thanks for your gift and for your hard work. And we didn't even talk about your opera setting for Nosferatu, my favorite horror film.
Well, we can save that for another opportunity.
And we shall. Your lips to God's ears. Godspeed, Dana. Thanks again.
Okay.
This is the Patrick Coffin Show. You can head on over to patrickcoffin.media for the show notes and links to danagioia.com and connect with this wonderful poet and his great work. Be a saint. What else is there?